So for those of you who are watching the recording, hi everyone, I'm Anita Varma. I lead the Solidarity Journalism Initiative and really excited to delve into this question, is that really journalism? Unpacking the connection or contention between journalism and advocacy. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to offer some background on where this question and topic comes from for me in my work, and then we'll open it up to our panelists to weigh in on some related questions, and then to all of you. So anytime I talk about solidarity, I'm always very keen to start by defining it. Solidarity has a lot of different meanings, as we have heard in media coverage and otherwise. So it's always useful, I think, to get our terminology on the same page. So the way that I define solidarity is this, that solidarity is a commitment to social justice that translates into action. And there's lots packed into a deceptively short definition here. So let's take this a piece at a time. Translates into action. So action means doing something out in the world. Solidarity is not just a feeling that we hold inside. It's not just a private thought that we might, secretly hold but never express. And it's also not just a promise to do something. Now, promises can be where things start, but solidarity can't start and end with a promise in the absence of action to fulfill that promise. So keeping in mind, solidarity is a commitment to social justice that translates into action, right? If you're wondering, well, how does she define social justice? I am right there with you. So social justice means dignity for everyone. And dignity is your intrinsic worth. People don't need to qualify for dignity. They don't need to earn their dignity. You don't get dignity by virtue of getting a degree or getting a fancy title. You're born with it. Unfortunately, as we know, across many societies, including the US, not everyone's dignity is intrinsically respected by institutional arrangements, but your dignity itself is inherent. So solidarity reporting is a commitment to social justice that translates into the action of reporting on issues that affect marginalized communities. And this reporting starts with the perspectives of people who are affected. Now, note that I said perspectives. This is not just their emotional responses. What we find again and again across contexts is that in a lot of journalism, folks who experience marginalization are relegated to only be having a chance to speak if they're expressing pain, if they're expressing sorrow, occasionally if they're expressing joy, but not if they're speaking from an analytical perspective or from a structural perspective about what's causing the emotional difficulties that they're having. With solidarity reporting, I always note this, that officials, elites, analysts, outsiders, we're not expelling them. They can come too. They can be included. They often are included, but they aren't prioritized over everyone else in solidarity reporting. So I'm sure many of you have read a story like this in recent days or weeks or months, where almost all of the story is quoting an elected representative in some jurisdiction. And at the very tail end, we have a quote from a person or a summary of a poll, right? Solidarity reporting would flip that to say, let's start with the folks who are affected. And we can also note, what are the folks in power doing? So as I said, solidarity reporting means starting with the people living it and representing them as the experts on the issues that affect their own lives. Because who knows what's affecting your life better than you? Arguably, no one, right? There's a distance attached otherwise. So what does this look like? Does it look like journalists knowing which side to take or choosing sides or insisting on focusing on one side and ignoring the other altogether? Well, no. The best solidarity reporting brings a bunch of perspectives to the table, but centers and centralizes the perspectives of folks who are affected. This becomes an act of solidarity. Why? Because historically, folks who experience marginalization have been left out of coverage of their own lives, which if you imagine someone writing a story about your house and excluding you from that story, that might be both troubling, inaccurate, and dehumanizing, given that you're the person living in that house. So from my perspective, I haven't actually said anything particularly shocking. Right? The idea that if we cover marginalization by reporting the folks who are experiencing it and including their perspectives on it, that this is nothing so earth-shattering. And yet, every single time I talk about solidarity reporting outside of a solidarity reporting workshop, I get this question, generally from someone who is quite well respected, established, and I would say generally well-intentioned with the question. But the question is that really journalism that you're talking about, Anita, with this solidarity stuff, or are you talking about advocacy? And that question, is that really journalism, is something that, to be honest with you, for all the years that I've been talking about solidarity reporting, I often jump to the defensive. I'll say, of course it's journalism, of course it's really journalism, and explain how historically we see these examples and enduring examples of celebrated journalism that's absolutely solidarity reporting. But I never, before today, really tackle this question about the connection between solidarity reporting and advocacy. So in preparing for today, I thought we should go there. So advocacy is defined as the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal. It means to add voice. Okay. So with this question, is that really journalism? So we've got real journalism over here, and then we might say that over here we have advocacy, right? Or are you talking about advocacy? It's got to be one or the other, that question would suggest. And maybe we might agree that journalism and advocacy are not miles apart. They might even, touch a little bit, but the two things arguably are separate endeavors. Well, we also have something that most of us agree exists called advocacy journalism. So what's that? Well, it's defined a few different ways. First, we have journalism that advocates a cause or expresses a viewpoint. And second, advocacy journalism has been defined as a style of reporting which promotes a specific political or social cause. Okay, so this is a little bit different. So on the one hand, we've got a construal where we would say journalism and advocacy. Is there a relationship? Not really. Either you're doing journalism or you're doing advocacy. You could be doing journalism that reports about advocacy, but these two things are separate circles. On the other hand, we have a construal that would say we've got advocacy and journalism, and there's this sliver of overlap. Quite intentionally, that sliver is at the edge of journalism, and the core, the central function of journalism in this kind of relationship diagram is pretty minimal. I mean, we would admit that this is a subset of journalism. Let me suggest a third way, which is that these are not two different circles, that journalism is advocacy. Now, I may have mentioned that I work at UT Austin. I'm in a school of journalism, and you might be wondering, well, Anita, are you saying you're in a school of advocacy? Why, yes, I am. So advocacy for what? Well, at best, journalism regularly and often quite proudly, very happy to declare this in journalism circles, they're very keen to say they advocate for and they stand for truth, for justice, which is often dignity for everyone. So if you think back to coverage of child labor conditions, of factory work conditions, of mental asylum conditions that were exposed centuries ago, all of that rolled up into a call for everyone to have a chance to have their dignity respected. And more recently, we see renewed and very fierce calls to equate journalism and democracy, to say that journalism must exist for democracy to exist. Well, democracy is a cause. I mean, it's not the air we breathe. It is a specific political cause that journalism institutionally and outside of institutional journalism is often quite keen to stand with. Let's not be too optimistic about this, though, because no one ever said advocacy has to be for social justice, right? Journalism in the US and elsewhere has also advocated for preserving the status quo, for offering narratives that say that the way things have been is the way they ought to stay. Why? Because that's the way they've been, even if the way they've been have subjugated and oppressed people. Journalism has also advocated for, continues to advocate for deference to institutional authority. That would be officials. If the mayor said it, it must be important. If the president said it, it must be newsworthy. And if thousands of people are marching in the streets, well, they must be disrupting traffic. Journalism in the US has definitely advocated for individualism. So a view of the world of society where individuals are responsible for themselves, right? If you're doing great, that's because you did great. If you're not doing great, that's because you messed up, right? This is advocating a particular viewpoint. Remember, that was part of our definition of advocacy. So the other thing I wanted to name in this space is that this question of, is solidarity reporting really journalism, is coming up in an interesting set of contexts. So when I'm speaking about solidarity reporting, it's often about cases like these, healthcare access disparities that have been exacerbated by COVID-19, family separation at the US-Mexico border, which obviously made huge headlines just a few years ago, housing instability, homelessness, poverty, climate change, climate crisis leading to displacement. And I'm talking about these coverage areas because they often have examples of coverage that represents the perspectives of people and communities disproportionately affected, right? But then the question that I get is, well, is that really journalism? So it leads me to wonder, if that's not really journalism, then what is? Well, if the stories that represent the perspectives of people affected by these issues centrally are not journalism, then the stories that don't represent those perspectives would have to be journalism. So these would be stories that cover healthcare access disparities, but never include the people who are affected by them. And the same for a range of other social justice issues. But these stories are somehow still happening, right? How are they happening? Well, they rely disproportionately on officials, on people with podiums, people with spokespeople. And that includes amplifying official information and also amplifying official misinformation. It is the case that this should make us uncomfortable. If real journalism, quote unquote, is strictly focused on people with podiums, then there's a lot of downside to that, right? We know that folks with podiums and official titles have denied that genocide is happening when and even after mass graves have been exposed. They've denied that police have murdered a person in broad daylight. They've denied that climate change is real, and they've denied the existence of a global pandemic and the efficacy of mitigation efforts, and gladly use journalism, quote unquote, real journalism, to amplify these claims and discredit lived experience that tells us otherwise. In short, podium journalism, official-oriented journalism, can take us very far away from that truth that journalism claims to stand for. So let me close, and really excited to get our panelists' thoughts on these questions in just a moment, by suggesting that instead of asking, is solidarity reporting really journalism, we might begin to ask, is reporting that excludes marginalized people from coverage of their own lives really journalism? Or is that just advocacy? Thank you so much. So with that, let me turn it over to Madeleine to get her thoughts on this question. Is that really journalism, or are you talking about advocacy? When have you heard this, and how would you respond to it?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Anita, for inviting me to be a part of this great discussion. Really look forward to the discussions and questions of everyone here. When reflecting on this question, I realized that actually it's a question that I asked myself earlier in my career, about 10 to 12 years ago. I promise I will not share the whole story of my career trajectory, but I started by working in community media and in more traditional media and public radio and magazines and wire services. And I went to grad school for journalism, envisioning myself as a future foreign correspondent. And it was in the midst of grad school that I wound up veering into human rights documentation and advocacy. And I did that because I saw that the work that really motivated me as a journalist to tell stories of marginalized communities, to tell stories of injustice, that these were being done, and in many cases being done better by non-journalists. This was a time when newsrooms were shutting down their foreign bureaus and were focusing on clickbait, and people from outside the field of journalism, whether we call them citizen journalists or human rights advocates, were actually doing really impactful storytelling. And I spent one summer in grad school as an intern for a wire service in Colombia, where there was a civil war going on. And I was there in our bureau office, assigned to cover Shakira's latest proclamation that she wanted to become pregnant. That is news in Colombia. And, we weren't reporting on what were clearly, much more important issues, because we didn't have access, we didn't have resources to report from those regions of the country. And yet, this was the time of the Green Revolution and I saw that the people who were doing that reporting, who were covering the civil war in Colombia, had YouTube channels or blogs, and they were communities who were themselves impacted by these issues. And that really intrigued me, and that's really where I kind of veered my career to work alongside folks who were documenting these stories and issues in their own communities. And I realized in really wrestling with this question at first, I realized that I could define my career not in terms of what organization I worked for and whether that was a news organization or an advocacy organization, but rather in terms of what I was doing, what was the objective. And, as I did begin to work for international human rights organizations, I was doing really exactly the same sort of work that I had been doing as a journalist, telling true stories, investigating issues, piecing together a puzzle and telling a compelling narrative. And in the process, I also learned that as a journalist, there was a lot that I could learn to do this work better from advocates, around building trust, around establishing informed consent, around identifying who's the audience for this story and how are we going to effectively reach that audience. These are issues that may sound familiar today, as all newsrooms are now talking about audience and have an audience strategy today, but 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. And so, I think what I've learned is that when you frame something as journalism versus advocacy, you really misrepresent what those two are, and that there is really a significant amount of overlap between the two.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. I love that Shakira example. Gabe, let's turn it over to you. When have you come across this kind of question? Is that really journalism, or are you talking about advocacy, and how do you respond to it?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly appreciated how succinct your presentation was, because I completely agree, especially the way you framed the ending there with journalism overlapping directly with advocacy. My journey throughout journalism has not been that long. I graduated from my undergraduate education in 2018, so I have not been in the professional journalism world that long. I think what brought me into journalism, though, is I studied city planning in college. And what brought me into journalism is I didn't like the college paper. I thought the college paper on campus was sort of racist. I thought they did a bad job of covering the campus community. And so I came at journalism by starting a blog and then essentially a newspaper in college, not because I knew how to report and not because I wanted to report, but because I wanted to advocate for coverage that actually reflected the campus community, that actually spoke to, student fees were up at a large university. I went to UC San Diego, were up in the millions of dollars, and they were being spent on various things without coverage. And I thought that was atrocious. And there's really, in San Diego, you have the Union Tribune, and they would pop in occasionally, and you might have like the local NPR affiliate, but otherwise you really didn't get coverage of a number of things happening on campus, unless it was huge, like the campus inspired the TV show Dear White People, for example, which is not a great legacy for the campus, but it's one the campus doesn't like to talk about. And it's something that we as a publication talked about. And so I think that experience, as I was thinking through wanting to be a journalist, I was also thinking through, what do I want to do as a journalist? What does it mean to be a journalist? And I think the more I interacted with traditional news outlets, the more I interacted with journalists that would tell me, I have opinions or values, but I just tend to stay quiet because I don't feel like I can say them. I don't feel like I can do things the way that I want to do. The more I realized I wanted to do things my own way, or at least in a way that I saw was slowly sort of burgeoning throughout the field. And so I think the thing that I think about a lot is, and this is something I talk about a lot, is the Washington Post, for example, has a slogan, right? The slogan is "Democracy dies in darkness." And even though that's the slogan, when you're at the Post, you can't advocate for DC statehood or voting rights in DC, right? And I think voting, at least in the US, is pretty critical to democracy. And so I find that contradiction just so ridiculous as we're considering like what it means to be a journalism outlet or what it means to be a journalist. How can you advocate for democracy if you yourself and your neighbors can't vote or participate in democracy? And so I think that's a really stark example of the ways in which journalism, at least these larger legacy outlets, have really failed to push the needle on what journalism needs to be. I think the ways in which I've heard this question, that's not journalism, that's advocacy. I hear it sort of in two ways. One, I hear it when people say like, and I've heard this in the past, that's not a story. That's, I think is sort of code for I don't think that's a story because I think that's advocacy. And then I've also heard, sort of that's activism. That's not journalism. And I think when it comes to that's not a story, what's really helped me is going to, group chats of like-minded folks that have also started figuring out what they want their journalism values to be and talking to them and reflecting with them like, hey, is my editor right on this? Hey, is that true? Like, am I sort of misunderstanding what's happening? And I think when it comes to, that's activism, I think, I was going to talk about this, but you hit the nail on the head, which is that you are advocating for things like democracy. You are advocating for things like what your community needs. And I think it's silly to claim otherwise. So I appreciate this panel a lot, and I'm happy to be here and talk about all this.
Thank you, Gabe. I feel like you set up what I anticipate Aubrey will take this in the direction of. Aubrey, when have you heard this question and how do you respond to this division claim between journalism and advocacy?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Full disclosure, my voice is definitely like a little shoddy. I'm recovering from a cold or really in the midst of it. So apologies everyone for my froggy voice and no camera. But thank you so much for having me here, and also for everyone who's spoken so far. I agree wholeheartedly with all of your points. This is something that certainly comes up a lot in my work. Reframe, the initiative that I lead at Resolve Philly, we help journalists use more humanizing language and essentially learn the gaps between the intent of their word choices and framing choices and the impact that they have on the communities that they either are trying to serve or think that they are serving or are serving. And because, a lot of the time generalizations and shorthand can be much more harmful in their use than journalists think that they might be. And often the conversations that we're having with folks are, use this phrase over that phrase. And that's when I get the question, well, like that's advocacy. If I use that term, that's advocacy, or that's what activists use, or that's what this specific group uses. So I can't use that. It's not the neutral choice. And I have that conversation quite frequently, frankly. And when, we have general skeptics of our mission, that's typically where they come from. They suggest that, oh, you just want us to advocate for that side of things. For instance, an example that I turn to a lot to illustrate this, I was speaking with a reporter a couple of years ago about the potential opening of an overdose prevention site here in Philadelphia. And it had been going through essentially like lots of pushback from different neighborhoods. The organization that was looking for a home for this site was trying to get a couple different neighborhoods on board so they could set one up. And there was arguments over whether to call it a supervised injection site or an overdose prevention site. And the organization trying to open the site did some research into the name of this and found that neighborhoods were much more likely to accept an overdose prevention site than they were a supervised injection site. And so I was talking with a reporter about this research. And they were like, essentially, well, then that means I can't use overdose prevention site because that's the one they want us to use. And I was like, I understand where you're coming from there, but if you think about it, now that you have this information, that you know that one choice is supporting this organization and one choice is hurting this organization, either way, you are having an impact on the dialogue going on here. It's just a matter of what type of impact you are having. There is no neutral choice then once you have that information. And that's where I see a lot of this conversation tying together in that language and the choices we make in framing and what we amplify in our journalism is all about the choices we are making and the choices we are not making. It's really about opportunity costs in a lot of respects. And I come to this from, I didn't study journalism in college. I studied English and critical theory, and which is a lot about what choices are absent and how language is power and creates power dynamics just in how things are framed. And so that's where we work a lot with journalists and just understanding the constructedness of journalism, that like you are always making choices, and there might be some choices that are more neutral or more or less polarizing or just like less controversial in your reporting. But there are going to be often times where there is not a neutral choice. And so if you are, as many of you have mentioned so far in the panel, that if you are, making a choice in one direction, you are also making kind of the opposite choice in the opposite direction. If you are choosing not to support something, then you're either choosing to support its opposite or choosing to denigrate it or whatever. There is kind of no zero-sum game in journalism, and that's where you're always advocating for something. It just depends on whether you choose to recognize it in your profession or not. And oftentimes our profession and the professionalization of journalism has led us to believe that certain choices are non-choices and that they are inherent and natural. And as Anita, as you mentioned, that often skews towards supporting those who are in positions of power or just the status quo. So yeah, that's certainly a question that I come across quite a bit, and to me, often says more about. So it's a question that reveals a lot more than it answers often.
That is a great way of putting it. And Aza in the chat raised a question that I think is a perfect segue back to Gabe. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here. Should we be thinking of a journalism outside of the formulaic dry confines of journalistic objectivity? So as I mentioned in the beginning, Gabe co-founded a media criticism venue called The Objective, which takes particular aim in its founding essay and mission at the heart of this question. Gabe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would love to talk about this. I tend to rely on this framework that Wesley Lowery talks about, and I'm sure you may have read Wesley's op-ed in the New York Times about objectivity, but he might be pulling this from elsewhere. But I think he talks about objectivity of self versus objectivity of a method. And I think the problem that we often have is a lot of journalists proclaim that they have objectivity of self, right? That they themselves don't bring bias to their work, that they don't bring anything to their work that might be construed as biased. And I think what often ends up happening is, rather than, and I'm sure a lot of you know this again, rather than sort of shielding the reader from any sort of bias, what you end up with is those in power in the newsroom dictate what objectivity is look like based on what makes them most comfortable. So that's often, like a cis white man dictating what objectivity is because he's more comfortable with that framework. Versus the method, I think objectivity is sort of a bad word now, in that it's hard to come back from its use in this way. I think it's really been damaged, but I think a method that aims to be fair and aims to really dig and research as much as possible before putting out a story, I think you could call that objectivity. But I also think that the word has been so destroyed by the use of an objectivity of self. So I think often now it's used as a cudgel, right, to punish reporters that don't look like or don't have the same experiences of those in power. And I think that's why we have the objective. That's what I've seen personally. That's what I've seen my friends go through and my colleagues. And so I think the advice that I'd give in general is, I think the most important thing to do as a journalist is to figure out, and constantly figure out, it's not just like a one-time thing, what your values are as a journalist and how you want to proceed as a journalist. I think a lot of folks can just rely on, the idea, oh, I'm objective, or I am a journalist that values, fair and accurate reporting. But I don't think those really speak to how you're going to be a journalist, the frameworks that you're going to use in your stories, what you're going to prioritize. Are you going to prioritize, and I'm sure you could do both, but are you going to prioritize AP style, or are you going to prioritize, solidarity journalism? What are the frameworks that you're going to bring to your reporting? I think is a really critical question. And for me personally, I think I'm at a point, I haven't been doing journalism that long, but I think at the point at which my values come into such conflict with the place that I'm working for, I would leave and rather do virtually any other thing and sort of freelance on the side, or figure out how I can do it on the side. And so that's what I've been thinking about. And yeah, someone, I think, Gina, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, brought up Walter Lippmann. And I think that's a great example of going back to how objective methods have been discussed over the years.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And totally welcome comments, questions, reflections in the chat too. Let me turn it to Madeleine. I was reading earlier about how El Tímpano started with a listening approach and a civically engaged strategy. Could you speak to that and what your thoughts were on not trying to adhere to kind of a traditional, neutral, objective Western 20th century model of what journalism should look like?
Yeah, I started El Tímpano, I don't think I set out to create a method that was, anti-objectivity. But, it prior to starting El Tímpano, I had been working at an organization called Witness, which is an international human rights organization that works with media activists around the world. So, those may be Syrian activists documenting the war in Syria, bystanders documenting police violence in the US, people who, in the words I know as Josh Stearns has put it, people committing acts of journalism. And I thought, why don't more newsrooms embrace this possibility of more people being a part of journalism, more viewpoints, more expertise being leveraged to tell stories. Without the media activists in Syria, we would not have important documentation of war crimes. And so, I thought, what other stories could be covered? What other perspectives could enter civic conversations and debates if those of us who are gatekeepers as journalists or news outlets can embrace that, can embrace more voices, or specifically and intentionally involve marginalized communities in our reporting. And so that's what I really set out to do in starting El Tímpano, was really to design it specifically centering Latino and Mayan immigrants who, are, at least here in Oakland, they're the fastest growing communities, and yet they're largely invisible in local and national media. Going back to what you said earlier, Anita, journalism traditionally reflects and perpetuates the status quo. So it is when journalists are challenging that status quo that they are forced into the framing of being activists. By centering our journalism around marginalized communities, El Tímpano is designed to upend that status quo. We're designed for equity. We're designed to inform and elevate the voices of marginalized communities. I think that produces much better journalism, but it does put us, kind of in the sort of framing of media activists I worked with elsewhere, who just because of the oppositional nature of their journalism are framed as activists.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think that's so sobering and true that the fastest growing group may be nowhere to be found in, particularly in news outlets that are constrained by the points Aza raises around a business model and economic pressures that come from that. Let me turn it to Aubrey to hear a little more about Reframe and how you work with newsrooms who might trap themselves in the neutral objective stasis and ways that you've approached that.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned a bit before, we work with newsrooms through workshops and some, closer intensive consulting around things like source tracking and content analysis. And we're working on some tools to help journalists write with more humanizing language in their work. But really all of it centers, excuse me, sorry, around this idea of adding friction to the editorial process in a lot of ways. So a lot of the ways that we talk about objectivity and kind of fret over objectivity come back to this, like, what is journalism and what has journalism been question. And so much of our work is really like unlearning, having the newsrooms that we work with unlearn the traditions that have been passed down that are harmful to both communities and the industry. Just, adding in the history lesson of that objectivity came from the business imperative to reach more audiences, that this, early 20th century journalism was very much a partisan endeavor that advocated for the everyman and very adversarially against a lot of institutions and people in positions of power and government and capitalists at the time. That's where that tradition comes from, is really just to the explosion of literacy and trying to reach more people in a competitive market. And so the idea of objectivity being like a stalwart part of everything that we do is a farce, essentially. I mean, it came from the commercial imperative. It is not necessary. This false ideal is not necessary to do the work of amplifying important stories and helping our communities solve our collective problems, right? And that, if that's what the mission of journalism is, advocating for change and spreading awareness of issues is not a bad thing. That is what we're here to do. So yeah, so much of our work is really kind of just like unlearning those premises of where that golden era journalism nostalgia comes from, and kind of debunking some of those myths, and also just really focusing on, like I mentioned, adding friction to the editorial workflow to ensure that we're pausing when we're making choices, when we might not realize that we are making choices, when we are relying on habits and muscle memory and, the source that is really easy to access, and the storyline that comes to mind when we think of a certain place or a certain person or a certain group. Trying to disrupt those habits to understand that we are making choices, and that we have to make those choices with the impact of those choices on the community in mind. And that's really like what is at the heart. That's kind of like, I call the Trojan horse of all of our work, is getting to that little nugget of information and getting us to like slow down a second and add friction to that process. And I hope and think that it really helps journalists get to take a step back and really think about the perspectives that are inherent in their own work from the jump.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And thank you for questions starting to come in. Please keep them coming. I'm going to ask one last question of our panelists, and then I'll stop the recording and we'll go to audience Q&A. I know in our group of participants here today, we have plenty of folks who are starting out in journalism or seeking new directions in journalism. And it can be daunting when there's institutional barriers to starting your own efforts or joining non-traditional efforts, we might call them. What advice, if it was just one piece of advice, would you give to, let's say, a very new journalist or student considering moving away from the neutral, detached, officials-only approach to reporting? Let's start with Madeleine.
Oh boy. Yeah, I could probably still use that advice myself. I would just say, there are so many ingrained and systemic barriers to producing journalism differently. And that goes from like the economic barriers to industry recognition. I continue to be told by funders that, journalism produced for working class immigrants will not make an impact. And so, what I've learned to do is ignore those folks and find the folks who believe in what I'm trying to do. And that might take a while. It might take a lot of persistence. But, I think an unconventional way of doing journalism is so needed. And so I just offer my encouragement for anyone trying to do that.
Thank you. How about you, Gabe? One piece of advice.
I think when you're starting out, it is completely fine. I mean, if you have a set of values and you don't feel like the outlets that you're applying to align with you, if your goal is to get a certain sense of legitimacy so you can get to a place where you feel comfortable starting your own thing, or you feel comfortable having the ability to work for others, I think that's totally fine. I would just add that you should know when to walk away, which is something that my colleague Lexi said on a panel the other day. And by that, I mean, know what your red line is in terms of things you will not do in order to work for an outlet. And if you have an internship there or a job there, I think explicitly say that, because I think the worst thing can be, inflicting harm explicitly through the coverage that you do, or, at the same time, just living with the guilt of having done that, I think are both terrible things. And you shouldn't put yourself in situations where that has to happen in order to keep working at an internship or a job. So just know when to walk away, and just, I think, be aware, as you probably are, that the journalism industry is precarious, and I think it's difficult already, but I think those are things to take away.
Thank you. How about you, Aubrey? Advice that you would provide for someone considering a different approach?
I'm gonna go wild card and say manage your Twitter intake. This is like maybe projecting a little bit, but Twitter is both a tool and a waste of time, and it is really important to find your boundaries around where that lives. There are so many great people to meet on Twitter. That's how I met Anita. This is like really great ways to meet people and like-minded folks on Twitter, but it can be such a drain and also is not representative of real life. And so it is really important to set boundaries around using that in journalism, because I feel like it's really easy for us to kind of get sucked into it, just being the news obsessives that we are, and to take a step back and see what life is like when you're not chronically online.
Yeah, that needs to be a t-shirt too. Thank you all so much. I'm going to stop the recording now and we will go into our audience questions.